Hi, thanks for watching and paying attention. My name is Mrs. Sturgis, and I've been working with the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation for many years. We care about old buildings and historic neighborhoods throughout the Pittsburgh region. I believe that those historic places can help you connect with the story of your city and even your nation. Raise your hand if you've been talking about the Underground Railroad or learning about slavery and civil rights. Perhaps some of you have read stories about fugitive slaves who escaped from the South before the American Civil War on a road to freedom to the North. Today, I want to show you a historic mansion that has survived in Pittsburgh for more than 170 years. But before we do that, I want you to understand where we are. We're up here on Mount Washington, one of the neighborhoods that composes the city of Pittsburgh. I have a map here. You can see how Mount Washington is south of downtown Pittsburgh. Mount Washington rises above the Monongahela River and looks down on the land in the fork of the Ohio River. Mount Washington, named for, you guessed it, George Washington, the first president of the United States. But many years before George became America's first president, he played a very important part in Pittsburgh's history. He was a Virginian colonist, and he was loyal to the British. He explored and fought in this region in the 1750s when he was in his 20s. And he wrote in his journal that the land is well suited for a fort. He advised the British to build a fort here. He was also with the victorious General John Forbes, the British general, when he came to the point and named and founded Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was named for William Pitt the Elder, Earl of Chatham. So here we are up on Mount Washington in Chatham Village. And if you look around, you'll see these red brick houses built about 90 years ago. And before Chatham Village was built, this was all pasture land and woodlands. And this land originally, actually, belonged to the Penn family. Remember William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania in 1681? Well, the heirs of William Penn, the descendants of William Penn, sold land to the grandfather of Mr. Bigham. And Mr. Bigham purchased land in this area and built a house. And that is the house that we will see today. Thomas Bigam's house was a stop on the Underground Railroad. You could take Penn Ridge Road to the Bigam House. Penn, William Penn, remember? And this road follows the ridge of the hill. We're not going to follow Penn Ridge Road, though. We're going to take a trail into the woods because in the old days, Mr. Bigham and his son Joel created a lane that would lead up to the front door of the house. And more than 160 years ago, fugitive slaves would have followed that lane to get to the safety of the Bigam House, a station on the Underground Railroad. So we're at the entrance to the woodlands. More than 160 years ago, fugitive slaves would have been walking in this wooded area at night. They would be guided by the North Star, if the sky was clear. Otherwise, they would be looking for patches of moss on the north side of trees, and they would feel the softness of the moss and know that they were heading north. They would have been very quiet, and they would have listened and been careful and overcome many obstacles. It was a dangerous mission for them to find a safe passage on their way to Canada, where slavery had been abolished and they could be free. Follow me. So imagine it's at night, and as you're walking on the trail, you hear the sound of water. It's a creek, but you don't know how wide it is. It's hard to see, of course, in the dark, and so you have to make your way carefully across the creek. Today, we have a bridge that's been built, and we'll pass over the creek and you can see it. So now you can clearly see Joel's Lane. This was created in the 1840s by Mr. Bigham and his son, and the hill leads up to the house that was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Let's head there now. I can see part of the house. We're getting close. If you were a fugitive slave, you would need a signal to know if it was safe to approach the house. Let's see what signal we can find. There it is. I see a quilt hanging from the porch railing, and I see a light on. A fugitive slave would know that the owners of the house were expecting him and that it would be safe to enter. Today, my friend David Vodder will meet us. He's an architect, meaning he designs buildings, and he also shows how you can fix and renovate and save a building. And he also lives here at Chatham Village. He'll be our tour guide inside. Hello, David.
Hello.
How are you? Thank you.
Coming out of the cold.
Great.
I thought it might be helpful to have you understand the history of this house by learning about the man who built it. This is Thomas James Bigham. Mr. Bigham was born in 1810 in Westmoreland County near Greensburg, but he didn't get off to a very good start. Before he was born, his father died. And when he was just a baby, a year and a half old, his mother died. The neighbors weren't sure what they were going to do with this helpless little baby. Finally, his maternal grandfather, James Christie, said, "I'll take the boy and raise him on my farm, and when he's old enough, he can help me with the chores." So that's what happened. Mr. Bigham began growing up on a farm. He noticed that the other kids in the neighborhood were going off in the morning to schools. And so he said to his grandfather, "How old do I have to be to go to school?" And his grandfather said, "We're not going to waste good money on book learning." Well, his grandfather wouldn't let him go to school. Mr. Bigham started to borrow the books from the other kids and read them at night. And he found an amazing thing happened. When he read a page, he could remember the story. Can you do that? Do you remember the words? Well, Mr. Bigham had a gift, and it was called total recall. A week later, he could tell you every word on the page. This was an ability that really helped him later in life when he became a very successful lawyer and publisher. Well, Mr. Bigham stayed on the farm until his grandfather passed away. And then he took the little inheritance that he had and decided now it was time for him to go to school. He enrolled himself in Jefferson College in Canonsburg, PA. And there he was a very earnest and able student. The other kids in the class used to call him Thomas Jefferson Bigham because he was so smart, but really his middle name was James. Well, Mr. Bigham graduated with honors and decided to move to the big city, to Pittsburgh. And there he studied the law under James Veitch and Thomas Bayard. He stood for the bar and passed the exam and set up his own office as an attorney in the city of Pittsburgh. Things were finally going well for Mr. Bigham. And then there came a great setback in his life. On April the 10th, 1845, a woman went out into her backyard in downtown Pittsburgh to start a fire to heat the water so that she could do some laundry. Well, she went back into the house, and the fire blew against the fence, and the fence caught on fire, and the fire from the fence blew onto the shed next door, and the shed caught on fire the house next door, and it was a terrible windy day. And the flames and the sparks continued to light other buildings on fire. Before you knew it, the city of Pittsburgh was on fire. At 12 noon, the bell in the Presbyterian church kept ringing and ringing and ringing to alert people that there was a terrible fire. The next day, an artist, William Coventry Wall, went out and drew a picture of Pittsburgh. All that was left were the brick chimneys and a few walls. 1/3 of downtown Pittsburgh burnt. Over 1,000 buildings, 12,000 people were left homeless in a matter of hours. Mr. Bigham lost his house, his law office, all of his books and papers. He had nothing but the clothes on his back. Here he was again, helpless. Who was going to help him? Who was going to look out for him? He learned a great lesson in life, that sometimes you have to trust other people. Well, Mr. Bigham couldn't continue the practice of law, and he heard that there was going to be an election that year, and his friends encouraged him to run for that office. And he was elected state representative because of his strong memory and his command of the affairs of the day. Mr. Bigham served in the State House. He met a young woman in Pittsburgh who was named Maria Louisa Lewis. And she also was an orphan and had started out as a child without parents. She lived on Mount Washington and owned a lot of property. And by the end of the year, they were married. Mr. and Mrs. Bigham decided to build a house on Mount Washington, away from the other houses so it wouldn't burn. And Mr. Bigham insisted that it all be built of brick. And that is the mansion that still exists today. Mr. Bigham and his wife built this house in 1849. And here they raised their family, 3 boys and 3 girls. And they were a very public-oriented family. They were involved in all the affairs of the city. Mr. Bigham was quite concerned about some of the social issues of the day, one of which was the question of slavery. Now, Pennsylvania had begun in 1776 as a slave state. No, it wasn't free, it was a slave state. But 4 years later, in 1780, the state legislature began a program of gradual elimination of slavery. It was only the second state in the Union to have such a program. And a very wise man in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin, founded the first society for the abolition of slavery in America. In 1847, while Mr. Bigham was serving in the State House of Representatives, he helped put forward a bill to finally end the gradual abolition of slavery in Pennsylvania. And Mr. Bigham voted for that law that ended slavery in the state of Pennsylvania. It was a great victory. If there is a law that's wrong, don't break the law, change the law. That's what Mr. Bigham did. Even though Pennsylvania eliminated slavery, in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, a very unfair federal law that required the sheriffs and the judges in Pennsylvania to assist in catching any escaped slaves and returning them to the South. Not only that, anyone who was caught assisting an escaped slave in a free state would be put in prison and would forfeit all of their property. So it was a great risk for anyone to assist an escaped slave. But Mr. Bigham decided to take that risk and decided to open his house to people that were in great need, traveling north, and allow it to become a stop on the Underground Railroad. And I know this because his son wrote a family history. And in it, he describes his father in these words. He became widely known as an abolitionist at a time when that cause was not popular, and not only aided with his tongue and pen, but for years maintained at his home on Mount Washington, a place of refuge for the footsore fugitive slaves escaping from their masters, called in the vernacular of those days, a station of the Underground Railway. The nurse for his two oldest children was a black girl, Lucinda by name, who never went outside the house by daylight and always fled to the attic whenever a stranger was in sight. That was written in 1911 by Kirkpatrick Bigham, Mr. Bigham's youngest son. From it, I surmise that Lucinda Bryant fled to the attic because she herself was an escaped slave. During the Civil War, Mr. Bigham also started a newspaper, and it was located downtown and in this building. And here, the Pittsburgh Commercial on Liberty Avenue, a beautiful cast iron front building. And Mr. Bigham's paper was an abolitionist paper, and it spoke against slavery. As you know, the struggle over slavery finally led to the Civil War. Slavery was finally abolished by the passage of the 13th Amendment in the U.S. House. And here is an image of the great celebration going on, that finally slavery was ended forever in the United States. Mr. Bigham and his children continued to live in this house, and in 1931 sold the property to the Buell Foundation, who wanted to build additional homes in the city of Pittsburgh for the working class. The Buell Foundation, as this old newspaper tells us, saves old mansion on Mount Washington. Underground railroad station recalls vivid days. The Buell Foundation built Chatham Village, and this book tells something of the history of Chatham Village and that development. Chatham Village decided to keep the old mansion and use it as the community center. And all sorts of events are held here now. There's lectures and parties and dinners and classes for the residents in the area. I'd like to show you some of the house. Let's take a walk and see some of these rooms. Come on in. This is the finest room in the house. It's the parlor, and this is where any important visitors would have been entertained. This room has a beautiful marble fireplace in the Greek Revival style. Notice the fret pattern, the Greek key. And these little squares are called dentals, much like our word dental for teeth. And a rosette in the corner. To keep the cold out, all of the windows have pocket shutters that open up to keep out the cold. Walk-in windows called a bay window. And it too has pocket shutters to keep out the cold. And at the center of the ceiling, a beautiful plasterwork frieze of flowers and leaves. The front entrance hall is 30 feet long, and this great staircase winds up to the second floor. And notice that it makes a soft curve as it reaches up to the upper floor. And look at the old handmade glass in the window and see how it ripples with the daylight. And this was the dining room where the family would gather for meals every evening. And it has a beautiful gray marble fireplace. The old kitchen was over here. It's all been updated now so that it can be used for community events. Here are some of the prominent abolitionists in Pittsburgh. On the left, Charles Avery. On the right, Martin Delaney. On the left, Thomas Bigham. On the right, Jane Grey Swisshelm. Jane Grey Swisshelm was Pittsburgh's first woman newspaper publisher. She was a friend of Mr. Bigham and published the Saturday Visitor on the presses at Mr. Bigams Newspaper office. This room is the largest room in the house. When the Bigams lived here, it was both a music room and a library. We now call it the Ballroom, and we hold all sorts of events and parties here. Outside, you can see the old dirt road that leads up to the house through the woods. Over here, on the mantel, is a photograph of Thomas J. Bigham and his wife, Maria Louisa. I wanted to tell you something about the architecture of the building. The style of the house is Greek Revival, and it's called Greek because that triangular pediment at the top is much like those used on a Greek temple. Notice the front door is very tall. On either side are thin windows. They're called side lights. And above the door, another window. That's called a transom. These were important to bring daylight into the center of the house. Here's the bay window from the outside. Notice the building materials. A sandstone base, which was quarried just over this hillside, and above, locally made red brick. Lucinda lived on the third floor, and you'll notice that the windows of her room face out in 3 directions, allowing her to see anyone approaching the house from a distance. You can see that added to the house was the brooker toothed in here to create a summer kitchen when it was too hot to cook inside the house during the summer.
Look at our plaque here, the historic landmark, the Bigham House. Read with me the date, 1849. Do some math here. You can take the current year and subtract 1849 from the current year to find out exactly how many years young this house is. Let's continue taking care of it so it continues living in the future, so new generations of Pittsburghers can learn about the Underground Railroad and really come in contact with it. Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation awarded this plaque to the Bigham House so people know about its importance. The Bigam House is part of Chatham Village, which is a National Historic Landmark. This place on Mount Washington possesses national significance for our nation, and you've learned why today, in part because of the Bigam House. Think about your own community. Think about the names of the streets where you live. Think about the important places in your community. Talk to older people in your neighborhood so you start to learn the story of your neighborhood. You can become part of our foundation by identifying what's important in your neighborhood and by taking care of those old historic places that hold the memories, the stories of our city and nation. Thanks for listening today, and keep exploring Pittsburgh's history. It matters.